Hi everyone, welcome to the training session that we have put together for you, newly appointed members of Highland Park's advisory groups, boards, and commissions. I am Steve Elrod, and this is my colleague Hart Passman. We're the Corporation Counsel for the City of Highland Park, and in accordance with the City Code, we are providing you this training session. We have a number of different items that we have put together that we think will help you be better commissioners as you sit through your meetings. Part of the session is a little bit of background on Highland Park, and then also some of the rules and responsibilities that the City Council has drafted into our code for you, the newly appointed commissioners. We're going to start with background on Highland Park's form of government. We're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of each commission member. We're going to talk about the Highland Park Code of Conduct, what was adopted a couple years ago by the City Council that is required to be followed by all members of boards and commissions. We're going to talk about the Illinois Open Meetings Act. In fact, we have a roundtable discussion that we've put together for you that will go into some of the details and examples of issues that may come up under the Open Meetings Act. Parliamentary procedure, Freedom of Information Act, and Hart's going to walk us through gift ban and ethics and conflicts. So, let's get started. Enjoy listening, and if you do have any questions about any of the material that Hart and I are going to cover today, please give us a call. We're happy to talk through it with you, and we will be delighted to see you if and when we are able to meet again in person. We hope will be very soon. Okay, let's start with Highland Park's form of government. So, Highland Park existed in an unincorporated status for many, many years in the 1800s. Not going to go way back, but I do want to just, because I think it's interesting as residents of Highland Park, and by the way, I too am a resident of the city of Highland Park. I found it fascinating when I did a little research and discovered that Highland Park actually was known by different names prior to being incorporated. It was first known early on as the town of St. John's. Later, or the village of St. John's it actually was. Later it became the town of Port Clinton, known then after the Port Clinton Land Development Company, which owned most of the city of Highland Park, what we now know.
Then the city,
yeah.
It was much smaller.
And then finally, it was named as an unincorporated town, the town of Highland Park. There were a number of issues that existed in the unincorporated town of Highland Park, primarily the number of taverns that were opened in Highland Park and unregulated. Highland Park and Highwood both had a number of taverns. Highwood still does. Highland Park incorporated in 1869 in order to control and regulate the taverns. And actually, the charter for the city of Highland Park, the 1869 charter, specifically says that one of the primary purposes was to regulate and eliminate taverns within the city. Highland Park was incorporated, and the form of government that it initially had was a mayor and aldermen. They had 2 wards. The city was divided into 2 wards, and they had 2 aldermen from each ward. In 1914, the city changed and became a commission form of government, where they had 5 commissioners, each one in charge of a different department of the city. And then finally in 1954, a referendum was passed where Highland Park adopted what is known as the managerial form of government. And that's what we operate under today. We have a full-time city manager. And that manager has a very significant role in Highland Park government. She is in charge of the day-to-day operations of the city. She has final authority with respect to appointment of all of the city staff. She appoints the police chief and the fire chief and the department heads. That is all on the city manager. The city manager is appointed by the city council, but all staff report to the city manager in this particular form of government. In 1955, the city changed the name of the corporate, changed the corporate authorities to a city council. And in 1970, when the new Illinois Constitution was adopted, Highland Park automatically obtained home rule authority. That enables Highland Park to enact laws pertaining to its own government and affairs without the need for this Illinois state legislature to give Highland Park the authority. It's a very important act of autonomy that the city of Highland Park obtained in 1970 simply because its population was more than 25,000 people. And Highland Park continues to enjoy its home rule status. In 1973, we moved to the form of corporate authority government that we have today. That is a mayor with 6 councilmen that are elected citywide. All 7 are elected citywide. And in 2021, the name of the councilman was changed to council member. And that brings us to where we are today. And the form of government that we have. So we have the mayor and city council. Under this form of government, it is the mayor that appoints members of the boards and commissions. She does that with the consent of the city council. So every appointment is made by the mayor, but then a majority of the city council must consent to that appointment. The city manager and the city staff provide services and staff the various boards and commissions, and our office, the Corporation Council, serves as the legal advisor to the city. We're not in-house. We're both Hart and I are at a law firm. We represent a number of different municipalities throughout the North Shore, but we're here to serve you in your capacity as commission members. We will, some commission meetings we attend on a regular basis. Either Hart or I or members of our law firm will be attending, and others we will attend on an as-needed basis. Either the chairman of the commission or a member of the city staff will make that call and determine whether or not we should be present. But we're always here to answer questions. If you have anything concerning an item on the agenda, be sure to go through the staff liaison before contacting us directly, but we'll be able to be in touch. Okay, moving on with our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the board and commission structure in Highland Park. Hart?
Thank you, Steve. As you just mentioned, all members of city advisory groups, boards, and commissions are appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city council. That's how you got here. That's why you're watching this video. Boards and commissions are controlled by Chapter 33 of the City Code. That's the general board and commission ordinance for the city. And I would encourage you to take a look at it if you're ever interested to know what specifically the city council has set forth for what your board or commission is empowered to do. All members of advisory groups, boards, and commissions must be residents of Highland Park. That's not necessarily required under state law, but that is a city ordinance. Members of boards and commissions have more rules than members of advisory groups. I'll start with the boards and commissions first and then tell you what's different about the advisory groups. Board and commission members are appointed for 4-year terms. Under the city code, no one may be appointed to a board or commission for a maximum of 2 4-year terms. They must then take at least 2 years off before they may be reappointed to their board or commission. The mayor and council not only appoints the members of each board and commission, but they also appoint the chairman and the vice chairman of the commission. Those offices are for 2-year terms, and they may not be appointed to consecutive terms. A board or commission can, on its own, decide to elect additional officers if they so choose, and they would just do that through their normal meeting procedures. Now, if someone is to be removed from a board or commission before the end of their term, there are a couple ways that can happen. More generally, the mayor has authority under both state law and the city code to decide to remove a member of a board or commission for any reason and at any time. She must notify the city council of that decision, and the city council has authority within certain parameters to restore a member if they believe the mayor's removal was not in the best interest of the city. We also have an automatic removal provision of the city code. This is one I caution you against violating because it is self-executing. Under the city code, you are expected and required to attend the meetings of your board or commission.
And that's attend, if they're virtual, attend them virtually, right. Or if they're in person, attend them in person.
Exactly. If you miss 3 consecutive meetings or you miss 51% or more of meetings in any 12-month period, then you will be automatically removed from your board or commission upon hitting that trigger. There is a way around that, though, if life gets in the way and you can't attend a meeting, whether for employment purposes, an illness, or other personal matter that keeps you away from the meeting. The city council can find that a member had a valid reason to miss a meeting. And a valid reason can be whatever the city council agrees is valid. It's not for us to say what that is, but certainly someone's out of town unexpectedly, someone or their loved one fell ill. The city council has been very good in the history of this ordinance in giving commissioners and board members the latitude to attend to their personal and professional lives. You have to request that the council find that your absence is for a valid reason. We recommend you do so before the absence. That obviously gives everyone enough time to work through whatever issue you're facing. It is possible to get the absence excused after the fact, but if that's the case, you must make your written request no later than 10 days after the absence. If you miss that 10-day window, the city council can't do anything for you, and that absence will count toward the 3 consecutive meetings or the 51% rule.
And I wouldn't wait till the third one. I mean, you could get the first absence excused, and that will then reset the clock or reset the counter on the number of absences that could lead to automatic termination.
Right, that's correct. Now, we'll talk later in the presentation about the Open Meetings Act, how that works for remote attendance or virtual attendance. As we film this now in December 2021, all city meetings remain virtual due to the COVID pandemic. We hope that will change one day and you'll be back in person. The rules will change on your participation. Certainly, as long as they're virtual, we hope you'll be able to join in by Zoom or whatever feature the city uses.
And you can zoom in from wherever you are, and it does not matter where you are or why you're away. If the determination has been made that the meeting is virtual, it's okay to be virtual. That's not the case, though, when hopefully we're back in the real world where meetings are in person. It is not, there is a process, but I will say that it's a very difficult process and should not be used frequently to attend a meeting virtually or telephonically if you are away when the meeting is required to be in person.
Correct. Thank you, Steve. A couple other quick requirements or provisions of the city code related to boards and commissions. Boards and commissions are expected, or at least have the ability, to adopt their own rules or bylaws. Some of the commissions have these. We encourage it, although it's not necessary if you are operating efficiently, as our boards and commissions are doing. You must comply with the Open Meetings Act in all your meetings. We'll cover that later on in this presentation. You are expected to follow Robert's Rules of Order unless the board or commission adopts its own substitute rules of procedure, whether in toto or on a case-by-case basis. Robert's Rules, as you may already know, is in many ways just become the default and expected set of procedural rules that not only public bodies, but even private entities and organizations operate meetings through. Finally, all boards and commissions must submit an annual report to the City Council detailing their activities over the prior year. Now, as I said before, this all applies to boards and commissions. We also have, in recent years, what's called advisory groups. Advisory groups are a little different. We didn't talk in the history section about the history of boards and commissions, but it wasn't that long ago that Highland Park had a very long list of boards and commissions.
More than any other community on the North Shore.
I think we were well over a dozen, and maybe up to as many as 20 at some point. There are actually only about 4 or 5 boards or commissions left, maybe a couple other statutory ones. We've got the Housing Commission, Historic Preservation Commission, Zoning Board, Plan and Design Commission. If we want to count other entities like the Board of Fire and Police Commissioners, but that's a statutory body. Library Board is technically a board or commission. There aren't that many. What the City Council did a few years ago is shift many of its boards and commissions to advisory groups. Advisory groups function in many ways the same way, but the specific advisory groups are not named in the city code. You can't find, for example, the Business and Economic Development Advisory Group in the code. Rather, the code says that the mayor and council can create and destroy advisory groups by resolution. And they have done so for a few of them. Some of you here today may not be here tomorrow if the council changes its mind. There may be new advisory groups that will have to watch this later because the council can create one when they see fit. And we welcome whoever you are. Advisory group members are appointed only to 2-year terms. There is no rule on consecutive terms for advisory groups. There are no term limits on the chair or vice chair. There are not set membership requirements, except that all advisory groups must have 7 members. You'll read in the city code for commissions and boards, there's an established number of people that sits on each board and commission. Advisory groups have to be at least 7, but they can be as large as the city council sees fit. Unlike our boards and commissions, which typically meet monthly or even twice a month, advisory groups only need to meet once a quarter. You can meet more often if you choose to, but the code only requires quarterly meetings. And finally, this training is actually not mandatory under the city code for advisory groups. We're glad you're here. We think this is helpful. We hope it's helpful, but technically this training was created for boards and commissions first.
All right, let's move on though to certain principles that, even though advisory group members may not need to be trained on them, they are applicable to advisory. This is in fact, the code of conduct that the city council adopted in 2020 is applicable to all members of boards and commissions and advisory groups.
And employees, and us.
And employees, and the city council itself. Let's go, I think it's important to go over that particular document very carefully. You should have it in your materials. You should read it carefully, but here are the guiding principles that guide all elected and appointed members at the city of Highland Park. And it starts with the words that you'll see above the doorway to the entrance of City Hall, the entrance facing St. John's, and that is, the salvation of the community is watchfulness of the citizen. And to support that guiding principle, the Highland Park City Council put together the following requirements. First, that all persons appearing at public meetings will be treated with respect. Second, that the City Council and all appointed city officials and all city employees will represent their respective office and the city with dignity and professionalism. Third, that the City Council and all appointed city officials and city employees, that includes you all, will build a capacity to work effectively together by depersonalizing issues, establishing a vision and setting goals, and building team expectations and teamwork. And finally, the principle that the good of the community is greater than the weight of any individual opinion or personal interest. Against that background, the city adopted several general standards of decorum and conduct. First, regarding the chairperson. The chairperson has responsibility and authority to control the meeting. All members must respect the decision of the chairperson. Second, use of titles. Members should use titles when referring to other members, such as mayor or council member or commissioner, or when addressing staff using their particular title, city manager, director, staff person, staff liaison, whatever their particular title is. Third, civility. Members should at all times be respectful of each other, of the city staff, and of all visitors attending a meeting. All oral discourse should be polite and civil, and members should never be belligerent, impertinent, threatening, or disparaging. Comments of a personal nature are never appropriate.
You know, it could sound, I suppose, to a critic, this sounds a little paternalistic, but we found, I certainly speak from my own experience, in communities where commissions and councils and boards behave with this level of civility and respect, their meetings run better. It's not just that people feel better about not being attacked, but that level of decorum and procedure and even a little formality helps with the accomplishment of the business.
And it helps, we can't control our our neighbors or our residents that are appearing before your commission. These rules can't, in general they apply to them, but we can't condone them. But you are models. If you conduct yourself with civility and with proper decorum, the likelihood of them appreciating it and acting in kind is strong. It's not a guarantee, and I think that you can admonish residents who don't act with civility to act as you do. You need to be examples and set models to your fellow neighbors and those appearing before. Next one is preparation for meetings. Members should prepare and for every meeting in advance. Do your homework. Background and informational questions should be addressed with staff members during working hours rather than during public meetings, unless the answers to such question will have an educational value for the entire board or the general public on a generally applicable basis. Next, members should maintain focus on matters of business before them, keeping in mind the principal role of each of your public bodies as policymakers. Discussion of matters not relevant to pending matters should be avoided. Next, respect for staff. Members should be respectful in every contact and communication with city staff, recognizing the scope and the weight of the staff's duties and responsibilities. And finally, respect for the speakers. Members should be fair, patient, and respectful of all individuals who speak before or make presentations to the public body at public meetings or at public hearings. No signs of partiality, prejudice, or disrespect should ever be evident on the part of any individual member. Again, many of these may seem axiomatic to you, and I know just because you were appointed, you very likely will adhere to these. But it is good to remind yourself that this is what is expected of you by the mayor and city council. And we hope that you will govern yourselves accordingly. It will make for a more productive meeting, and it'll make for a better city. With that, we want to get right into the nitty-gritty of the Illinois Open Meetings Act. And what we have prepared for you is a virtual roundtable. Hart and I will be joined by our colleagues Brooke Lenneman and Peter Friedman in a four-way discussion on the Illinois Open Meetings Act. Welcome to our pandemic-era roundtable. Actually, 4 squares. The 4 of us are going to be talking about the Illinois Open Meetings Act. We have polled our managers and elected officials and have come up with the most frequently asked questions concerning the Illinois Open Meetings Act, and we're going to get started right away. Brooke, let's start with you about what actually is a meeting. If 3 members of a 7-member board want to go to a Cubs game together, is that a meeting?
Well, Steve, let's look first at how the Act defines meeting. A meeting, according to the Open Meetings Act, is a gathering of a majority of a quorum for the purpose of discussing public business. So in your example of going to a Cubs game, it's fine as long as they don't discuss public business. If they start to discuss public business, you can get into a sticky situation where it may be a meeting and the Open Meetings Act would apply.
So we need to also figure out what's a quorum. So for a 7-member board, a quorum is 4. So a majority of the quorum is 3. So they could be implicated. If 2 of those members wanted to go to the Cubs game and discuss public business, would there be a problem?
No. So that would not meet the test of a majority of a quorum, since it'd be less than 3.
Got it. Okay. So is this Illinois Open Meetings Act applicable to home rule, or could home, and we've discussed home rule in the course of this seminar, is home rule exempt from the Open Meetings Act?
No, it's not. And the Open Meetings Act provides minimum standards that must be met by all municipalities, including home rule municipalities. They can enact more stringent rules, but at a bare minimum, they must follow the Open Meetings Act requirements.
And it's important to note also, we're not just talking about the councils and boards, of course. We're talking about all the subsidiaries of the municipality itself.
Exactly. So one of the questions that is asked all the time about concern electronic communications. and whether the use of electronic communications constitutes a meeting, or is it only when you're gathered together in person?
Well, the Open Meetings Act, I imagine, was intended for in-person meetings first, but most of the tricky situations now come with electronic communications. The shorter answer, Steve, is yes, electronic communications count for purposes of the OMA, and in fact, these are some of the problems and the pitfalls that we caution all of our clients to be on the most careful lookout for. Telephone, of course, if you had a conference call among a majority of a quorum to discuss public business, that's a gathering. If you have emails, that's a gathering. The Act contemplates the notion of contemporaneous communication. There is perhaps some point at which an email and a response are not contemporaneous. We'd rather not test that theory. When you have an email on which you've got two members of the board communicating and a third one is copied, if it's a 7-member board, you have triggered a meeting, as Brooke described a few moments ago. The biggest problems we see are in social media. And perhaps the best example might be Facebook, because it remains such a popular outlet for so many people. Imagine, if you will, a Facebook page that is designated for some community issue or generally for news that are happening in your city or village, and a member of the city council posts something. It could be anything related to the city in theory, because the city council has to deal with everything. And a second member responds, even if the response is simple as, "Great point, Joe, I agree." If a third member is merely observing that conversation, you've got a problem under the Open Meetings Act. And because social media sometimes doesn't tell you who's watching, it is of particular importance that elected officials and members of any public body be extraordinarily cautious in what they post and where on social media. It's just too easy to cause a problem.
And Hart, just going back to the emails though, that's why we always caution never reply to all. It's okay for there to be a one-way communication of information from the village manager or the administrator. That's okay. That's like sending out a letter. It's the reply to all that's contemporaneous. It's all members of the corporate authorities, and that's where you trigger an Open Meetings Act problem.
That's right. Let me take two responses to that, Peter. You're absolutely right. First, you mentioned the village manager administrator. He or she is not subject to the Open Meetings Act. They're not members of the body. They can communicate with two other members of the board as much as those three people want. Second, as you mentioned, it's not so much the initial email that causes the problem. It's the reply with a third person, in our 7-member example, watching. Now, the safer course, if you're a member of a public body, is not to send that email at all. If something is that important that you need to talk to your colleagues, we'll talk about it in a minute, call a meeting. But if it's necessary, it is very important not to reply to all for the reasons you just mentioned.
All right, so we know what can trigger a meeting. What about what are the requirements? Brooke, maybe you can take this for holding the meeting itself. What are the implications if you have a meeting? What do you need to do?
All right. Well, first, I think it's important to note that there's several different kinds of meetings. There's regular meetings, there are special meetings, and there's emergency meetings. For all types of meetings, one of the requirements is that the meeting needs to be held at a time and place convenient and open to the public. So that's basically at a time that most people can attend in a location that's, can fit enough people and is reasonably located in town. And a quorum needs to be present. The Open Meetings Act says that the quorum needs to be physically present, but there are exceptions, and we'll talk about those later. But for regular meetings, those meetings are noticed up as part of an annual schedule that's adopted at the beginning of the year, stating when all the regular meetings will happen. In addition to that annual schedule, you need to post notice at least 48 hours in advance of the meeting with that agenda for that meeting. For special meetings, there's still the 48-hour advanced posting of the agenda, but the notice obviously would not be part of the annual schedule. So notice needs to be made, including posting notice in City Hall or Village Hall and on the website, and again, at least 48 hours in advance. For an emergency meeting, obviously by its nature, it's an emergency, so 48 hours may not be possible. in which case notice is just required as soon as practicable, both in, to post it and to notify any news media that have registered to obtain notice.
All right, now the big question is, who can call a meeting of a board of trustees or the city council?
Not us, not the village attorney. So there are basically three bodies or people that have the authority to call a meeting. And by the way, no matter who it is, they have to comply. The meeting that is called has to comply with everything Brooke just said about whatever meeting is being called. But the first entity that can call it, of course, as Brooke just said, is the full board or the full council when they adopt a resolution at the beginning of the year setting the regular meetings for the year. They have set and called their regular meetings when they adopt that schedule. Secondly, the mayor or president of the municipality has special power granted under statute, home rule and non-home rule, to call meetings, whether special, emergency, or reconvene, whatever it is. The mayor or the president has that independent authority. The third option is the one that sometimes tricks people up. It is, and this is our firm's opinion, that a majority of a quorum of the public body can call a special meeting. So in a body that has 7 members, if 3 of those members desire to have an emergency or a special meeting, they can force that public body through the village manager, administrator, to call that meeting and set the agenda for that meeting.
Peter, who sets the agenda for that meeting? I mean, I asked Steve that question. How do you figure out who can talk about what at that meeting? How does that work?
I'll take it, Peter. The agenda really depends on local rules. You got to check the local rules of the individual municipality. It typically is the mayor or the manager or a combination of the two. The other big question that we frequently get asked is, can members of the city council or trustees on a village board set the agenda or put an item on the agenda? And here's our rule of thumb, and it's based on the logic that Peter just went over in as to who can call a meeting. Our firm believes that since a majority of a quorum, 3 in a 7-member body, members of the council can call a special meeting and therefore have an agenda item at that special meeting, those same 3 people or 3 people can put a matter on an agenda. It's based on that same theory.
Right. The idea being, of course, that if those who technically set the agenda refuse, those 3 people could call their own special meeting. And what would be the logic in doing that? It's a practical response to a situation that may or may not be faced in each municipality. What about the public?
Yeah, that's a great point. So you have the mayor manager, you have the 3 members of the council or members of the council. The question that's getting asked recently is, can a member of the public demand that something be put on the agenda? The answer is an unqualified no. The public has no right to set the agenda or have a matter be put on an agenda. The member of the public would have to request any of the individuals that we just mentioned to use their power to put a matter on the agenda.
Thank you, Steve. Let me ask this question now. I'm going to take a jump off from our agenda setting. And our attendees here, they may be familiar. There'll be specific items listed on an agenda, a resolution approving that, an ordinance amending the code, approval of warrants. And then there's some other items that may be discussed here and there. Is that okay? Must the agenda include every matter that happens to be discussed at the meeting? Must the agenda include every matter that might receive some kind of a vote at the meeting?
So it's an interesting question as well. The answer is, the agenda does not have to include every item that is discussed at the meeting, but there is a difference between discussion and action. The Illinois Open Meetings Act is clear that the public body can discuss anything in open session, whether it's on an agenda or not. But when it comes time to vote on it or taking what's called final action, there was actually a case that came out of the 4th District Illinois Appellate Court in 2002 that said a municipal body cannot take final action on a matter that is not listed on the agenda. Now, we've just been litigating a case in the city of Chicago where the Chicago City Council approved a planned development ordinance that was not on the agenda. The interesting issue is, what is the consequence of that? The challengers wanted to invalidate that planned development ordinance. The court ruled that that's not the appropriate remedy. It does not invalidate the underlying action, but there may have been a violation of the Open Meetings Act, and penalties that are associated with that. We'll get to that later in this session.
Exactly. And before we switch gears a little bit, I do want to point out, Steve, when you say that anything can be discussed by the public body, that presumes that the meeting was properly noticed in accordance with some of the guidelines that Brooke set out. So if you have a properly noticed meeting, now you're free to talk about whatever public business you want. You may not be able to act on all of it, but that all has to do with our agenda setting. Let's talk about the end of the meeting, and perhaps better said, the minutes of the meeting. Peter, could you describe for our group who takes the minutes and how should they be prepared?
So it ordinarily, the minutes, first of all, are very important. They are the official record of what has taken place at all meetings. There have to be minutes for each meeting, no matter what type of meeting it is. Ordinarily, it is the clerk. Doesn't have to be the clerk, but ordinarily it is the clerk. And the big question about minutes is, how detailed must they be, and how are they approved? With regard to minutes, minutes should be what has happened, not necessarily every word that was said. So technically speaking, the minutes have to provide when the meeting convened, who was there, a general description of the discussion, and I mean general, it does not have to be specific, and whatever, and if there are votes taken, what the vote was, who made it, who seconded it, and what the vote was, and who voted which way, and then what time the meeting adjourned. Those are the technical only requirements that are necessary for minutes. And the question we get always is, how detailed must minutes be? And all of our communities have different policies and practices and history with this. Some are very brief and some are more extensive. Our general opinion is, the more extensive, the more issues that can be created, particularly about controversial issues where there was an hour or two of debate. Trying to summarize an hour or two of debate in written minutes is almost impossible. Inevitably, someone's comments, whether it's a member of the corporate authorities or a member of the public, will not be included or not be emphasized as much as someone else's will. And you get into this issue of, why is that comment in there and not another? That's why we default to a general description of the discussion is all that's necessary. And that's just best practice. The minutes themselves have to be approved by the corporate authorities. They have to be approved in open session. They have to be approved. They're almost always approved at the next meeting, but they have to be approved within 2 meetings. And the final issue that we often get is a member who was not present at a meeting, but then is there at the next meeting when the minutes of the meeting at which they were not present are on the agenda for approval. Can that member vote to approve? And the answer is a definitive yes. The only caveat is, as with all matters that are on the agenda, there is a fiduciary duty of the members to have acquainted themselves with the matter and read the materials so that they can make an educated vote. Same for the minutes. If there are minutes on the agenda where a member has not been there for that meeting, they should review the minutes and review in some way what happened at that minute so they can in an educated way vote whether or not to approve those minutes.
All right, so let's talk about what's probably the most frequently asked open meetings topic questions we get, and that's the public comment period. So this is something we get a ton of questions about. It's always interesting and sometimes controversial. So let's talk about this for a little bit. So first of all, Steve, maybe you can clear up just one fundamental question at the beginning of this, which is the difference between a regular public meeting and a public hearing.
Right. I think that we need to clarify that at the very start. The vast majority of the meetings that are conducted by a city council and a village board are public meetings. What we've been discussing, the Illinois Open Meetings Act require that the meetings be public. It's not a public hearing. A public hearing, which may be conducted on a zoning matter by a plan commission or a zoning board, that's an opportunity for the public to be heard, for the public to actually participate in the meeting. That is a public hearing. A public meeting is merely an opportunity for the public to observe the meeting. No participation is required. No hearing of the public is required and need not be allowed. That basic fundamental distinction needs to be understood because the vast majority of the meetings of city councils and village boards, as I said, are public meetings. Now, having said that, back in 2011, the Illinois Open Meetings Act was amended to add a requirement that says any person shall be permitted an opportunity to address public officials under rules established by the public body. That's basically public comment time or hear from the audience. And that's now a required agenda item on all public meetings. But read the words carefully. It does not convert that otherwise public meeting into a public hearing. It does not give the public the opportunity to be heard and to participate in the village board or city council meeting. It merely gives an opportunity for the public to address the village board or city council. And that address could be in writing, that address could be limited to a 3-minute comment period, and there need not be a response by any member. In fact, we advise against responding or interacting with the public. This is just their opportunity to make a statement, to address their public officials.
All right, so speaking of public, let's talk about what the public is. Can you restrict who participates in public comment just to residents of the town in which the public body is located?
No, you can't, Brooke. The Open Meetings Act does not draw that distinction. The public comment period is for the public, period. You can prioritize residents.
You can prioritize.
And it's not on,
right,
you can prioritize. Yes, that's a yes. You can prioritize. If you want to take public comment first from residents and then from non-residents, that's perfectly okay. But anyone has the right to show up to any meeting and at public comment period have their voice be heard. In this era of Zoom, does that mean someone can Zoom in from across the ocean? The answer is yes, but you have to be on this side of the ocean first before we hear from our friends on the other side.
All right, and so if you're a town, it's fairly common for commenters to be asked to give their name and address at the beginning of their public comment. Is it permissible to require someone to give that information? If someone refuses, can you prohibit them from making a public comment?
You cannot. There was an opinion of the Public Access Counselor, which is the arm of the Attorney General's office that enforces the Open Meetings Act. Opinion several years ago where the PAC said, no, you cannot condition participation at the public comment period on someone giving their name and address. You can ask, but if they refuse, they still have the right to speak. They should not be punished in any way for refusing to divulge that information. That is their right.
And Hart, going to your previous point, it's specific to your address. You can ask, do you live in Winnetka or Highland Park or North Brighton? You are allowed it for the purposes of prioritizing those public comments. You can ask for that information.
Correct, but even you're right. And I suppose if someone refuses to answer even that, you can treat them as a non-resident, but you still couldn't prohibit them from speaking. They still have the right to address the public body. And I want to pivot off that to something Steve mentioned a moment ago about responding. I bet none of our attendees thought that this section of the seminar would invoke the Constitution, but there's a constitutional principle here, and it's one that we've litigated and won. The United States Constitution guarantees the right to redress government, to petition your grievances. It says nothing about the government responding. And we've won cases for our municipal clients that didn't respond to someone's letter or didn't respond to someone's public comment. And the court said, no, that's you don't get an answer. You don't get to demand what's on the agenda. You don't get to demand that your public officials respond to you or even respond to you a certain way. You just get to have yourself heard. And so our advice generally on public comment is protect that right. It's important, but you don't need to go farther. And
giving an ad lib impromptu answer usually creates problems. Our best practice advice, if there's a legitimate concern or complaint raised by one of your residents, is to say, we will give this matter to the village manager or city manager, who will refer to the appropriate staff, and they'll be back to you tomorrow.
So let's pivot now to what we've all lived through for the last 13, 14 months about remote participation. We had all, through these seminars before, had all gotten in our heads exactly what was required for members of the public body to participate remotely. There were very strict requirements. And then all that kind of got thrown up in the air because of the pandemic. So Steve, why don't you just take us through how that's evolved?
And remote meetings truly has evolved, Peter. You're right. Let's review a little bit about the pre-pandemic world, because fingers crossed we may be going back to it unless the state legislature creates further change. In the pre-pandemic world, Illinois had strict rules and regulations governing remote meetings. The individual public body had to have a remote meeting policy, written policy in place, and the body must have a physical quorum present at the village hall or the site of the meeting. So that if you're a 7-member body, 4 members have to be present in order for any of the other 3 to be remote. And the only way that the other 3 could be remote is if they fell into one of 3 very limited circumstances. They had to be ill, it had to be a legitimate emergency, or they have to be away on work, not vacation, not a second home that may be in Florida or California, but it has to be their work related. And it was very difficult for public bodies to allow individual members to participate remotely. Some of our towns have adopted rules that reverse the presumption and allow an excuse to be valid unless it's challenged. But be aware that the rules are very strict for participating remotely in a pre and possibly in a post-pandemic world. But now we are in the pandemic and are for at least the next several months. And I want to just briefly tell you what's the lay of the land. An open meeting can be conducted completely virtually with no members present if several prerequisites exist. One, the governor has to have issued a disaster declaration, either for the entire state or for the region of the state where the local government is located. And then the chairperson, either the mayor of the city council or a chairperson of any other subordinate body, has to make a determination that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent. The public must have access to the meeting through through a remote platform like Zoom or others. And at least one member of the public body or the chief legal counsel or the chief administrative officer has to be physically present at the village hall or city hall, and that must remain open. Now, during the meeting, all members have to be verified and they must be able to hear each other. All votes must be by roll call vote, even, unfortunately, a motion to adjourn. And the town must keep verbatim records of all of the meetings.
Right, and Steve, you mentioned the rules and we've gotten accustomed to them. The governor could waive some of these according to the statute. The governor could say that not even the village president or chief legal counsel needs to be there. Our Governor Pritzker has not seen fit to do that. Whether that would be different at a different stage of this pandemic or a future pandemic, remains to be seen.
That's right, Art. And also note that there is a bill pending in Springfield that would expand the remote participation even in a post-pandemic world, but it's very controversial, and we'll follow it and certainly will advise you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. All right, so we've talked a lot about open sessions. The other big thorn, in addition to public comment, is closed sessions. Peter, how does a public body go into closed session?
Very carefully is the answer. So first, just on closed session, I just want to say we all agree with this, but one of the most challenged, litigated aspects of the Open Meetings Act compliance is whether a public body has properly gone into closed session, and once in closed session, whether they have stuck to the rules of what can be discussed in closed session. It is the Illinois Open Meetings Act. It is not the Illinois Closed Meetings Act. So the presumption of all of these things is that meetings should be open. And that's why there are a whole bunch of rules about how you get into closed session. So first of all, you can only go into closed session once you're already in an open meeting. You can't just, be at Wrigley Field and have a closed session. You have to do it by motion. The motion has to cite the specific exception that you are going through, and I'll just briefly talk about the exceptions in a second, but you have to cite exactly why you're going into closed session, and then you have to have, that motion has to be seconded, and then there has to be a roll call vote, and that roll call vote has to be passed by a majority of those present. The one thing I would say to that, in addition, is ordinarily, most of our municipalities put a line item on their open session agenda that says closed session, but technically speaking, anytime in open session that there's a need for a closed session, you can go into closed session so long as you have the proper vote, regardless of whether it was designated on the written agenda. With regard to the reasons you go into closed session, there are some that are very standard that are most often used. Pending litigation is one. Collective bargaining matters. Real estate purchases and setting the price for the sale. The one that is particularly troublesome, which was the subject of an Attorney General opinion just a few weeks ago, was the probable or imminent litigation exception. Those words are important. It is probable or imminent. It is not threatened or possible. Possible means it could be a 1% possibility. That is not enough. The Attorney General has said it has to be more likely than not that litigation will be ensuing. In our mind, that means it's got to be greater than a 50-50 chance. And it has to be close at hand. So the fact that, and this was the case in the Attorney General decision, in that case, the municipality went into closed session because a property owner says, well, I'm gonna retain an attorney on this matter. The municipality interpreted that as, oh, okay, so now they've got an attorney, we're going in because there's possible litigation. The Attorney General said just the mere fact that they had retained counsel was not enough under this exception. So all of the cases and the Attorney General opinions on closed meetings, the presumption is that it is very difficult and narrowly construed exceptions. So when we, as your attorneys, you will see us in meetings, one, being very strict about why we're going in, and once we get into closed session, we may interrupt discussions that get outside of the lane of the permitted exception, because the violation, one, it's a public relations nightmare if there's been an illegal closed session, and two, courts will require, if there has been a violation, that the verbatim transcript and the minutes of that closed session all be open to the public. So there's serious consequences for violations, legal and practical.
Thanks, Peter. You mentioned the minutes and the recordings. Brooke, how are those handled? Forget a violation, because none of our clients will ever have this problem, of course. But how should they manage their closed session minutes and recordings of closed session meetings?
Well, closed session minutes remain confidential, but there is a requirement that they be reviewed twice per year. So during that review, the purpose of the review is basically to determine whether the original reason for confidentiality still exists. If it does, that's fine. You've reviewed it, it can stay confidential. If the reason for confidentiality no longer exists, like it's regarding collective bargaining agreement from 5 contracts ago, then it can be put on a list and approved by the public body for release. There's sometimes confusion about whether or not approving it for release means that it's automatically disseminated to the public, and it's not. Basically, those minutes are converted to regular minutes that are releasable if the public body receives a request, a FOIA request for those minutes. Regarding the verbatim record, as we mentioned earlier, there has to be a recording of all closed session meetings. That verbatim record needs to be kept for at least 18 months. But then it can be destroyed as long as a couple of conditions are met. First, that the public body has approved the destruction of the recording, and 2, that the minutes for that meeting that took place have been approved. So there's some summary or record still available of the meeting. If those 2 things have been done, then it can be destroyed. We have prepared policies for a lot of our client municipalities that avoid a municipality having to approve the destruction of every individual verbatim recording. If you should check your town's policy on that, and if you don't have one, feel free to reach out to us.
Let me ask one more question real quick, Steve. It's for the group. We talked about closed sessions. What about executive sessions?
Same thing.
It's anonymous, but
Same
the proper
thing.
term is closed session.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I want to make sure we got that out there.
Next up is a segment on parliamentary procedures. This will be presented by our colleagues Peter Friedman and Brooke Lenneman.
All right, so we're going to talk about parliamentary procedure and voting. And the first thing to understand about these rules are, where do they come from? Parliamentary procedure and voting rules come from one of 3 places. They either come from a state statute, like the Illinois Municipal Code, or what's called the Statute on Statutes, that has some rules that apply to meetings and how they're run, or local codes, your local municipal code. Many of them have very detailed procedural rules on meetings. Some don't have detailed procedures, but we always look to those codes as well to make sure that we're following all of whatever rules may apply locally. And third is something everybody has heard of called Robert's Rules of Order, which is a very big set of parliamentary procedures that apply to any group of meetings or associations, but they do have a lot of specific rules that apply to bodies such as local government bodies. And the key thing to know about, it doesn't have to be Robert's Rules of Orders. It could be Joe's Rules of Orders. But a lot of times these local codes will specifically adopt the latest version of Robert's Rules of Orders, and that's why we will always refer, if we have a rule problem, to Robert's Rules if it has been adopted locally. So now let's talk about voting.
Votes can be taken in multiple different ways, and I like to think about them as sort of a spectrum of formality. The most informal type of vote is a vote by unanimous consent. That's when someone may ask, I move to take a recess during a very long meeting. And the chair can then just say, if there's no objection, we'll take a 5-minute recess. Assuming no one objects, then that motion passes and they can take a short recess. The next type of vote that's slightly more formal is a voice vote. That's where the chair would ask all in favor, and people in favor would say aye or yes, and then all against, they would say no. Then the next vote would be a roll call vote, and that's when they go name by name through the public body and say yes or no on the motion. There's a certain circumstances where a roll call vote is required. First of all, a roll call vote is required for all ordinances. It's also required for any motion or resolution where the spending of money is being approved or there's liability being incurred. It's also important now to take roll call votes during all remote meeting motions of any type during COVID remote meetings. And also when voting to go into executive session, a roll call vote is required.
And on roll call votes, there's a particular issue that comes up on roll call votes what happens when somebody abstains or somebody has a conflict and can't vote. There is a specific rule dating back to 1982 to an Illinois Supreme Court decision involving the village of Fox Lake. And the court basically said that every time there is a roll call vote, every member of the body there, no matter what they say, yay, nay, abstain, or I don't want to vote, has to have some legal significance. Each one of those things has to have some legal significance. And so the court said, if the requirement, and this is the requirement for the passage of ordinances require the concurrence of a majority. And the court said, in that case, where you have a concurrence, any vote, a vote to abstain is deemed to be concurrence with the majority because you had the opportunity to vote no, you chose not to, so therefore you are concurring with the majority. Now, there are a lot of situations, both in statute, annexation agreements, for instance, or local codes that specifically have language that don't say the concurrence of a majority. They say the affirmative vote of 4 members. Whenever the statute or the rule says the affirmative vote, then anything other than a yes vote is a no vote. The majority rule goes away. So for instance, if there's a vote 3-1 in favor of something, let's say there's only 4 members present, and the vote is 3-1, or 5 members present, and the vote is 3-1, and the 5th member abstains, and the requirement was for a concurrence, then that abstention would go toward the 3, which was the majority, and the final vote recorded in the minutes would be 4-1. If that vote required an affirmative vote, then that abstention would not go to the 3, that abstention would go to the 1, and the vote would be 3-2, not 4-1. So it is important. It does come up because abstentions and conflicts come up. I will say, with regard to conflicts, we run into this all the time. There are some times where there's a conflict and you have no choice. You have to abstain, and you may not want your vote to be counted one way or another. The way to cure that is to literally leave the dais so you're no longer present and no longer voting. So let's talk about rules on motions.
So obviously before there's a vote, there has to be a motion made. And there's some just basic rules about motions that we wanted to make sure you all are aware of. First of all, the chair cannot make a motion. But the chair can recognize another member, and any other member can make a motion upon recognition by the chair. All motions, or almost all motions, need to be seconded by another member. And if you make the motion, the member that makes the motion should refrain from speaking or arguing against that motion, although that member is always free to have heard the discussion and decided, actually I'm going to vote no. In the alternative, if you second a motion, you can speak and vote against it.
And that last rule is really to prevent gamesmanship. I mean, the theory of Roberts on these rules is if you make a motion and therefore want to put something before the body, it should be something you are in favor of. Now, there are some situations where somebody just wants to get something on the floor and they may not be in favor of it. But generally, if you're the motion maker, you're not supposed to vote against it. But again, local rules may say something different. So let's talk about some common motions and common motions that come up frequently. One of them is what happens when the vote is made and then there's a change of mind. There are 2 ways to handle this. One is a motion to reconsider. Motion to reconsider, if that is adopted, all that means is the original motion that you are trying to reconsider is back on the table for consideration. It doesn't reverse the original motion. So in order to reverse the original motion with a motion to reconsider, it takes 2 votes. A motion to reconsider should be done at the same meeting at which the original vote was made, and it must be made by a member who voted with the prevailing side of that original motion. It can be seconded by any member, and it's debatable. There is often a question of when that motion has to be made. The most logical and safe route is to make that motion at the same meeting. It's possible it can be done at a second meeting, but not if there are intervening rights that have vested, such as if there's a public hearing that has taken place, or that if a contract is entered into and the contractor has started to perform under the contract. So generally it is best, if there's going to be a motion to reconsider, to do it at that meeting. Now, the simpler way to truly change the body's mind, if that is the consensus of what to do, is to not do a motion to reconsider, but rather do a motion to rescind. If a motion to buy a copier is later decided to not have been the right decision, then all that is necessary is a motion to rescind the original approval, and that wipes out that original vote. Again, we have to be careful to make sure that that copier hasn't already been delivered, or that those rights haven't vested, because then you lose the ability to do that without negative consequences. So now, Brooke, the other thing that happens a lot is that it's not that they want to reconsider or amend, they just want to push something off or kill it.
Right, yeah. So sometimes, basically the body is just not ready to take a vote on that item. And either they want, an applicant to come back with more information, or staff to come back with some more information. And so the idea would be to continue it until the next meeting or until another date certain. That motion is sometimes conflated with another motion, which is a motion to table. There's some important distinctions that we should all know because they have very different effects. So a motion to continue to a date certain is debatable, number one, so you can debate whether that's a good idea, what date to come back to, etc. And whereas a motion to table is not debatable. If a motion to table is made and seconded, there's no discussion about it. There just needs to be a vote on that motion. And the effect of that vote is that the item is tabled indefinitely. It's killed. And it would need to be brought back in the same way it was originally put on the agenda again. So a lot of times we hear people say, I want to table this, or I make a motion to table, and usually the intention is really that motion to continue it until a date certain.
And we will say, when that happens, you will often see us at these meetings clarify with the motion maker, are you moving to table? Are you moving to postpone? Are you moving to table to a date certain? Because as Brooke said, they can have very different consequences for the matter being discussed. And finally, the infamous, I want to change my vote. I changed my mind. This has come up. Members vote and they decide they want to change their vote. The rule is that as long as the vote is still being taken, you can change your vote. Once the chair has announced the vote, then you cannot change your vote without the unanimous consent of the body. The other way to handle that is if you can't get unanimous consent or it's too late otherwise, you can also have the minutes reflect that you made a mistake. And that had you not made a mistake, you would have voted yes. There are all sorts of kind of optic implications for that, but that is the other way to handle it if procedurally there's no longer any way to change your vote.
Next up is a segment on the Freedom of Information Act. This will be presented by our colleagues Ben Schuster and Stu Weiss.
Hi, I'm Stuart Weiss. I'm here with my colleague Ben Schuster, and we're going to talk to you about the Freedom of Information Act, which is the flip side of the sunshine laws that you heard about earlier, the Open Meetings Act. The Open Meetings Act talked about how and when you should actually do things in public, and we're going to talk about records that a municipality creates that are in public. Now, a municipality creates a huge amount of records, whether they be utility bills, legislation, maps, and all of those are presumed to be public. Now, having all the business that you do be, and every record that you create be a public record that is subject to inspection can cause some confusion and problems sometimes.
And part of that is starting with what the law states itself. So let's first talk about the general rule in the very opening paragraph of the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act starts off by saying all records in the custody or possession of a public body are presumed to be open to inspection or copying. Any public body that asserts that a record is exempt from disclosure has the burden of proving by clear and convincing evidence that it is exempt. So from a threshold issue, if the village has a record, if a public official has a record, and we will talk about some exceptions to this, your presumption should be that the public can get it, they are entitled to a copy, and they're entitled to see it. So I did mention that there are some exemptions to this. So the Freedom of Information Act starts with this presumption, and then it has approximately 60 to 70 different exemptions that allow certain types of material to remain confidential.
Are you going to read each one of them line by line for us tonight?
Very slowly.
Okay, awesome.
I will talk just about a couple of them, but you can imagine that our municipalities have all sorts of information that is incredibly sensitive that would do great harm to the municipality as well as the public if it was made public. So we're not going to go through all of them. The good thing as a public official, you are not going to be the one tasked with doing and processing FOIAs on a day-to-day basis. But you should be aware of a couple things. So number one, we don't have to release to the public information that's private information. So what does that mean? We're talking about people's home addresses, their personal phone numbers, bank account numbers, what I like to call the identity theft information. We have an ability to withhold that. We also can withhold highly personal information. This is what I always call the ick factor, the information that's in a record that, you know, when you would read it, go, ick, if this was about me, I wouldn't want to be made public. And a good example for that is there's a lot of things in police reports that deal with domestic disputes, health records that deal with medical information. That type of stuff is exempt.
Now, Ben, is that subject to any sort of kind of balancing test when you're looking at it? Because, you know, there's not an exemption for just embarrassing things that you wish the public hadn't heard you say.
That's correct. Generally speaking, we can withhold highly personal information if invasion of personal privacy outweighs the import of the public interest. So there are things that the public interest really needs to see and hear, and so it may not be subject to that exemption. So there's a couple of others. I'm not going to go through every exemption that's in FOIA, and certainly not every one on your screen. Another one to know about, though, is preliminary drafts and notes and recommendations in which policies are and opinions are expressed and policies formulated. If you are corresponding with village staff or perhaps other officials about what should we do in formulating a policy, there's a chance that some of that information may be exempt. The other one that's really important to know as a public official is your communications with us. Your Elrod and Friedman attorneys are usually exempt from disclosure. They're subject to the attorney-client privilege if you're seeking legal advice, and there's an exemption in FOIA specifically to protect that.
What if I have a stamp that's nice and red that I put on a document that just says confidential? Does that help?
I wish I had a stamp like that, but it doesn't help with FOIA. What it primarily does is just says when we have to disclose the record, look here first. So if you produce 200 emails and one of them says confidential, top secret, it just means that that's going to be the first email they read. There is no exemption in FOIA that says if you label it confidential, that alone makes it confidential.
So I should use blue ink and not red ink for my stamp?
That's exactly right, Mr. Weiss.
So, as Ben said, as an elected official, you're not going to be responsible for responding to FOIA requests. But the communications that you create could be. And this has been the subject of a lot of litigation. And as we move into an era, or we're well in it now, where communications are not just what happened on camera, they're not just letters, they're not just even emails, there are text messages, they could be on group chats. They take so many different forms, and there have been a number of cases that have tried to look at when, basically, where's the line? When is something no longer a public record? The first case that we'll talk about that really dealt with this head-on was the City of Champaign versus Madigan. And this is from 2013. And it was a case where a journalist from the City of Champaign was sitting in front of the City Council, watching something being discussed. And you've seen this happen, whether it be at a meeting, in your private life, where there's a gathering of people, somebody is texting, and you can tell they're texting somebody else in the room. Because literally they hit enter, they look up, they stare at the other person stares back at them, looks at their phone, and then laughs. This journalist saw that kind of interaction kind of ping-ponging around the dais. And his curiosity was piqued, and he wanted to know what were they saying. Now, these were communications between two elected officials, not employees, on private devices, on their phones, which were not issued by the city. So were they public records? What was interesting is, in this case, in 2013, the court kind of dodged that. And they said, yes, they're public records, but it's not because they were on a private phone versus a public phone. It's because the elected officials were sitting on the dais at the time acting as elected officials. Steve and I, in the first session, talked about when does your voice count? When do your actions matter as an elected official? When you're sitting on the dais voting. And the idea was that, especially these city council members, they were acting in their public capacity during a meeting. When they stepped off the dais, that didn't apply anymore. Now, that was a nice, bright line that we had for a few years. But now, it's gotten more complicated.
It's gotten more complicated because, as Stu indicated, when you're on the dais, you have the emails, you have those private text messages. They're in the possession and control of the public body because you're all convened. But it's gotten more complicated because there are public officials that aren't just village trustees who are only convened when they're all together as a public body at the dais. So what happens to a village president or a mayor or staff of a municipality, and they're using private email or private text messages? And this is where it's gotten more complicated. So I'm going to tell you a story of a 2020 case, the Better Government Association versus the City of Chicago. And this case is fairly notable. You may have heard of it. It involved the former mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, and some of the executive staff in the mayor's office and other public officials with the Chicago Public Schools. And in that case, they were sending private text messages, and it was private emails that were going between these officials outside of a meeting. And the court found very differently. Instead of just saying,
when you say private emails, do you mean like emails that were sent to an address that didn't end with .gov?
Correct, yes. A Gmail account, for example, or a Yahoo account. So they were being sent in that manner, and the court looked at the situation and said, well, this is a little different. While public records may be between public officials if it's sent to a quorum and they're all together or on the dais, the other key to it is they say many such communications are prepared for or will eventually be used by a public body. And when they're in the hands of a mayor or a staff member or some other official that's executive in nature, they're acting for the public body, not just at a meeting, but outside of a meeting. And they have powers to carry on public business outside of that meeting. So those records are public and may be disclosed under FOIA.
Even though they were on private devices, sent to private servers outside of ours, because they could eventually be in the possession and control of the public body.
Correct.
It's kind of like the Chekhov's gun of FOIA there.
Yeah. Now, the most interesting part about the case is really the language that was used in it. So I wish I could tell you that the bright line rule today is that it was for a mayor or village president, they just have their own operating rule, but it won't apply to trustees. But what it does state in the case is many such communications are prepared for or will eventually be used by the public body. And we think that language in the future may be used to broaden the mandate that all public officials, whether a trustee or not, may be subject to FOIA at all times. Now, what does that mean? We're not telling you never to send an email or never to do it necessarily on a private account or never send a text message. The tail should not wag the dog. There are situations in which sometimes that may be the best way to communicate, or it's just more efficient. But that said, you should be prepared for those records, those emails, those text messages to be made public. What that means is you may have a duty to go get them and provide them. It also means that you should be careful. We have seen so many times before that when people use text messages, or perhaps on a Gmail account, they're a little more casual because they don't think anybody's going to read it. Maybe it's a snide comment. Maybe it's an off-color joke, or something just taken out of context 7 months later just doesn't read well. So our most important advice to you is before you put pen to paper or thumb to your screen on your iPhone, is just double check, read it twice, read it 3 times, make sure that you're okay if it would be someday made public.
Finally, we're going to talk about subject matters that concern you as an individual commissioner, both while you're on the dais and when you're outside of City Hall. We're going to start with the Illinois Prohibited Political Activities Act.
Thank you, Steve. There is a state statute that restricts your ability to engage in political activity now that you are an officer of the city. And that is, in fact, how you're considered under our statutes. You are not just a volunteer who comes to a commission meeting. You're an officer of this city, and so you have certain restrictions on your conduct. Most importantly, the statute prohibits the performance of political activities during compensated time. That term compensated time is pretty easy to apply to employees of the city who are also subject to these restrictions. We know generally when employees clock in and clock out. For those of you that are not full-time employees, that only have duties during certain times, most likely just when you're at your commission meeting, it's a little harder to determine what compensated time means. What has come to be understood is that you are on compensated time when you are at the meeting. Or I suppose if your commission decides to run an event or have you do something on the commission's behalf, you're now performing and acting as a commissioner or board member, and so you may not engage in certain political activities during that time. What are those activities? These are probably pretty obvious. Campaigning for someone for elected office.
And that means wearing a campaign button or a hat.
Fundraising.
Circulating a nominating petition.
Exactly. But that first one is probably the most important. When you are at City Hall for your commission meeting, and it is election time, you may not wear a button for whoever your preferred candidate is. This doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, or other. It is a prohibited political activity for you to be engaged in any type of political activity during compensated time. For us, for you, that means when you enter the building for your meeting, you're on compensated time.
Importantly, your mere appointment as a commissioner does not restrict your First Amendment rights to campaign for a candidate outside of your attendance at your board or commission meeting. You're welcome to do that without any repercussion at all. That is your right.
Correct, and that's true for everybody. That's true for up and down the line of the city. In that same vein, no city property can be used for political activity at all. At any time. That includes use of City Hall, for example. You can see these rules relate to one another. There's also rules on condition of employment. Probably doesn't employ to commission members, but we want you to be aware of it. There's a gift ban act as well. This is similar in that it controls how you behave vis-a-vis the public in activities that aren't directly related to your commission. You cannot accept a gift generally from a prohibited source. Again, you're an officer of the city, and for some of you, your decisions really have direct and final impact on some pretty important investments, namely people's property. So this law has some serious import for all of you. What is a gift? A gift is broadly defined. It's any tangible or intangible item having monetary value. Certainly physical goods, gift certificates, money, these are gifts, but even the intangibles can count as a gift, and we encourage you to think broadly about it so that you do not inadvertently violate this law.
And it's important to talk about an inadvertent violation. There may be a very innocent, non-nefarious situation where a naive petitioner may not understand that there is such a prohibition, and by way of wanting you to get to know their proposed use, we'll send you a sample or we'll send you some little minor gift to demonstrate their appreciation. That could violate the act, and what you ought to do is immediately contact the staff liaison. Let them know what has occurred. We'll take it from there, but you keep your radar up and be careful not to unwittingly get involved in a situation like this. And folks, it has happened. And most of them have been innocent, but it's happened.
Yeah. Prohibited source is not everybody. You can probably accept the gift from your Uncle Frank unless he's applying for some kind of city relief or variation. Generally, anyone who is doing business with the city or wants to do business with the city or seeking relief from your commission, they are prohibited sources. Those are the people you have to be on guard for. It does not apply to your family members or friends in most circumstances. There are exceptions to the gift ban, lawful political contributions. Some of you may have in the past or in the future may run for office while you're a member of the commission. There are ways that that is okay if it's done through campaign laws in Illinois or the federal government. As I mentioned, there are ways to accept gifts from relatives and friends if they're not also seeking business of the city. Travel expenses, educational materials, those are the kind of things for which there are statutory exceptions. But I would say if you are ever concerned, contact us. This is a good point to tell you. In addition to being the city's general legal advisors, we are the city's ethics advisors as well. We are here for each of you on a confidential basis. If you have questions about any of these ethics-related laws, you can reach out to us directly. We get these calls from time to time. We're more than happy to walk through your options, whether it's meeting attendance, recusals we'll talk about in a moment, gift ban. We're here to guide you through those laws.
And finally, we'll discuss the Highland Park Ethics Guidelines that have been carefully crafted and adopted by the City Council. The City Council spent a number of years actually putting this together through several iterations and amendments. They wanted to, and I think do have, among the strictest guidelines on ethics on the entire North Shore. So let's make sure that you're fully aware of them so that you can govern yourself accordingly.
Ethics guidelines were first adopted in 2007. They have been adopted and remain in place for all elected and appointed officials. So commission members, board members, advisory group members, this applies to you as well.
So that you're operating under the current set and you make sure you have these in your possession. It's the most current guidelines are those that are dated as of January 2020.
Correct. We could have an entire session on the ethics guidelines. We'll give you a summary of what's there. Again, please contact us if you have specific questions. But in summary, a few things. First, members of commissions may not have an interest in any city contract, work, or business. There's an exception for owning less than 0.5% of a company. Functionally, that means if you own stock in a publicly traded company, the city can buy Coca-Cola if you own 100 shares.
Right, or if you own stock in McDonald's and McDonald's is coming before you for a sign relief or a variation, you don't have to recuse yourself unless you own more than 0.5% of McDonald's, which probably is a significant amount of money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, congratulations. Maybe what happens most common with the guidelines, restrictions on representations before other boards and commissions. There are limitations on when you can go in front of a different board or commission advocating for something or other, whether for yourself or others. And the most common question we get has to do with disclosure and recusal requirements. That is, when are you prohibited on a specific matter from participating in your board or commission's deliberation? Let's talk about that in a little more detail. The ethics guidelines specify certain circumstances when you must disclose and recuse from the discussion.
And Hart, let's talk about what does disclosure mean? What does recusal mean?
It's an excellent question. Under the guidelines, and the council crafted this carefully, disclosure means you have to identify very generally the nature of your conflict.
In public.
In public, at the meeting, but you don't need to go through all the details. It is sufficient, for example, to say, using our first example, I need to disclose that I represent Mr. Smith, the applicant here, on other matters. I cannot participate in this discussion. You don't need to discuss what it is you're doing for Mr. Smith. Those of you, for example, that are attorneys understand the very nature of your work with the individual may itself be confidential, and you're not required to divulge things that are not appropriate for public consumption. But you do have to identify publicly the very general nature of why you're disclosing.
And so now what does recusal mean?
Recusal is also defined in our code. Recusal means you step off the dais, you leave the room, and you have no contact with staff, the applicant, or any members of the commission until after the commission has reached its decision on whatever the matter may be. If, for example, the matter is heard on one night and continued, you are still under a prohibition from discussing that matter with your fellow commission members until they get to a decision at the second or whatever subsequent meeting. You are completely barred from engaging with anyone at the city regarding the matter from which you've recused yourself.
And if we're still living in a virtual world and you can't physically step off of a dais, what you're going to have to do is zoom out of the meeting, end your session, and then dial back in.
And we'll do that. We've arranged that where the staff liaison will text you or call you, hey, that matter's over, come on back, we need you for the next one. Not a problem, but you must abide by these guidelines. Representation of an applicant, whether current or previous, is the most common reason for recusal. You may have a professional relationship with someone such that it is not appropriate for you to participate.
And that happens a lot. Many members of the many residents of Highland Park that get appointed to boards and commissions are professionals that are engaged in the world of municipal and government law, where they're representing other parties, either as a lawyer or an architect or a planner or a landscape architect, and they do this for their day jobs. But the problem is that if they are representing during their day job an applicant that's appearing before the commission, that becomes an issue.
Right. A few other examples on the screen, but I want to talk about the last bullet here because this is the deliberately vague appearance of impropriety prong. Very generally, the ethics guidelines state you may not participate and you must recuse if there is an appearance of impropriety. It doesn't say what that is. That's going to be a case-by-case determination. It's one that you will have to make. We'll say many times the appearance of impropriety is worse than actual impropriety. And the reason for that is, how bad is the cover-up? The cover-up is often worse than the crime. So, while on one hand, you have been appointed to serve, your job is to come to the meeting, you should find reasons, if it's legal and ethical, to participate. You are also commanded to recuse if you have some relationship to a matter or to an applicant such that your participation would look bad.
Or if it would make you unable to render a fair and impartial judgment. And look, we all, well, I do, and you all live in Highland Park. You're bound to be deciding on a matter that's in some way touches you. Your neighbor, your son-in-law, your best man or a bridesmaid at your wedding.
Congregant at your church or synagogue.
Somebody will be appearing before you. Those are typically not grounds for you to recuse yourself. It's understood that in a relatively small town, there will be an issue that impacts you. You are expected to rise above that. You are expected to be able to render a fair and impartial judgment that isn't going to be guided by your own personal biases or relationships with that individual. However, and so that's the expectation. The expectation, as Hart indicated, is for you to serve, for you to vote. That's what you've been appointed to do. However, if that connection is so direct and so immediate that you're unable to render a fair and impartial decision, or the optics are that it would look so bad as to taint the entire process, then we do have an appearance of impropriety. We don't have an appearance of impropriety simply because you know the applicant.
Right. Now, there are matters for which you must disclose a relationship, but you do not have to recuse yourself. And we've got some on the screen. There are certain types of representations in a professional capacity. If they are concluded, and for unrelated matters, you merely need to say, for example, this was my client on something that had nothing to do with this matter. I don't represent them anymore. Membership or volunteering with a nonprofit organization or church or synagogue where you're not an officer, religious institution of any kind, that you may have to disclose but not recuse. If you're not receiving compensation related to your connection to the matter, that may be a reason to disclose but not recuse. And self-representation. And on this one, you are of course entitled, as the owner of property perhaps, to seek relief or approvals for your own property. And you can be the person that steps forward in front of a commission, even your own commission, to advocate for that. But of course, if you're the applicant, you can't also be a voting member. So you would step around from the dais.
One or the other.
Yeah, you would disclose, hey, you may remember me, I was the one that was sitting there a moment ago. I'm now the applicant. Treat me as just the applicant. Don't do me any favors. And all of you having gone through this training will know to do just that.
And that is the training. We are always here to help you with issues that were not specifically addressed or covered in this training. You see, we tried to give you the full gamut of Illinois municipal law and try to get touch on everything that you will be dealing with in your capacity as a newly appointed commission or board member or advisory group member. But there are bound to be issues that come up along the way. We're here to help. More importantly, your staff liaison is here to help. Contact your staff liaison. If you have a legal issue, they will then get in touch with us. And on behalf of Hart, myself, and all of our other colleagues that you heard from here at Elrod Friedman, thank you for allowing us to serve as your corporation counsel, and we look forward to working with you. Congratulations on your appointment.